Which? You should have never come. Vanessa's voice cut through the restaurant like a knife, sharp enough that every fork paused midair, and for a second, all I could hear was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft clink of glass somewhere far behind me, as if the entire room had stepped back to watch what I would do next, and I remember looking down at my hands, still resting calmly on the edge of the table, noticing how steady they were despite the tension pressing against my chest, and I thought, not for the first time, that silence can be louder than any insult when it stretches long enough, when it fills the space where something should have been said, and I slowly lifted my eyes to my son, Daniel, sitting just across from me, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere near his untouched plate, and he didn't move, not even a flicker of discomfort strong enough to reach his face, just that quiet, practiced stillness, the kind that tells you this moment didn't surprise him, the kind that tells you he had already chosen a side long before I walked through those doors, and I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not even hurt in the way people expect, but something colder, something clearer, like a window finally wiped clean after years of fog, and I reached for my napkin, folded it once, carefully, the way I always had, and placed it beside my plate as if this were any other dinner, any other evening, any other version of the life I thought I still belonged to, and I could feel eyes on me from every direction, strangers pretending not to stare, waitstaff hovering just out of reach, unsure whether to step in or step away, but no one said a word, because moments like these don't invite interruption, they demand observation. They pull people in with a quiet kind of gravity, and I understood that too, because I had spent most of my life being the one who kept things smooth, who absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it, who made sure every gathering looked perfect from the outside even when it wasn't, and maybe that was why Vanessa thought she could do this, why she believed I would simply shrink, apologize, disappear into the background the way she had been quietly pushing me to do for months now, maybe longer, and I let my gaze drift briefly across the table, noticing the small details I might have ignored before, the way the check folder had already been placed near my seat, not Daniel's, not hers, but mine, as if the ending of this evening had been decided long before the first drink was poured, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was precise, intentional, a small piece of a much larger picture that was finally beginning to make sense, and I realized then that this dinner wasn't about celebration, it wasn't about family, it was about positioning, about drawing a line so clearly that even I couldn't pretend not to see it anymore, and for years, I had told myself that Vanessa just needed time, that she would come around, that love and patience would soften whatever sharp edges she carried with her, but standing there in that moment, with my son silent and my presence unwelcome, I understood something I should have seen much sooner, that some people don't want peace, they want control, and they build it quietly, piece by piece, until one day you find yourself sitting at a table that no longer has a place for you, and I took a slow breath, letting the air settle deep in my lungs, steady and measured, the way I had learned to do through decades of holding things together, and without raising my voice, without giving anyone the reaction they might have expected, I reached for my purse, stood up from my chair, and gave a small, polite nod to no one in particular, as if I were simply excusing myself from an ordinary meal, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to perform the role someone else has written for you. And as I turned toward the exit, I could feel that same silence following me, heavier now, more uncertain, as if the room itself had begun to realize that this moment hadn't ended the way it was supposed to, and I knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was not the end of anything. It was only the point where I finally stopped pretending I didn't see what had been happening all along. I did not go home right away that night, even though the drive back to my house was only 15 minutes, a straight line down Maple Avenue past the same grocery store where I had shopped for years, past the park where Daniel used to ride his bicycle in uneven circles until he finally learned how to balance without falling. And I remember pulling into a small parking lot a few blocks away from the restaurant instead, turning off the engine, and just sitting there with my hand still resting on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet settle around me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, because for so long my life had been filled with other people's needs, other people's voices, other people's expectations, and now there was nothing but the soft ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of traffic moving along the highway, steady and indifferent, and I realized that what had just happened was not sudden. It was not an outburst born from a single bad evening. It was something that had been building for a long time, quietly, carefully, piece by piece, until it finally revealed itself in a way that could no longer be ignored, and I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for a moment. Not to escape the memory but to replay it with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, and I could see it now. The small things Vanessa had been doing from the very beginning, the way she would speak over me at family dinners, smiling as if it were nothing, the way she would answer questions directed at Daniel before he had a chance to respond, as if she were translating his thoughts for him, shaping them into something more convenient, and I had told myself that it was just enthusiasm, just her way of fitting into the family. But looking back, I could see the pattern, the slow narrowing of space, the quiet adjustments that placed her at the center of everything while I was gradually moved to the edges, and Daniel had changed too, not all at once, not in a way that would have startled me into action, but in small, almost invisible ways. He called less often, visited less frequently, and when he did, there was always a sense that he was measuring his words, choosing them carefully as if trying to avoid stepping into something he did not fully understand, and I had chosen to be patient, to give him room, because that is what mothers do. We step back so our children can build their own lives. We tell ourselves that distance is a natural part of growing up, even when it feels like something else entirely. And I remember the first time Vanessa suggested that Daniel and I should not discuss financial matters anymore. She said it lightly, with a laugh that made it sound like a harmless boundary. But there was something firm beneath it, something that did not invite disagreement, and Daniel had nodded, not looking at me, just agreeing in that quiet way he had developed, and I had accepted it, because I did not want to create tension, because I believed that trust would carry us through. But sitting there in my car, I understood that trust had been slowly replaced by control, and not just in words but in actions, in decisions made without me, in plans I was informed about only after they were finalized, and even tonight, the dinner itself, it had been presented as a simple invitation, a chance to spend time together, but now I could see the structure behind it, the way everything had been arranged, the timing, the placement, the unspoken expectation that I would walk into that space and accept whatever role had been prepared for me, and I opened my eyes, looking out through the windshield at the empty stretch of pavement in front of me, and I felt that same clarity settle. Deeper, stronger, no longer uncertain, and I realized that what mattered was not what Vanessa had said, not even what Daniel had failed to say, but what I was going to do next, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer trying to fix something that was quietly breaking around me. I was finally seeing it for what it was, and that changed everything. The next morning felt quieter than it should have, the kind of quiet that does not come from peace but from something being removed, something no longer trying to hold everything together, and I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully settled into the sky, moving through my kitchen with the same routines I had followed for years, measuring coffee grounds, filling the kettle, setting my favorite mug by the window, but there was a difference in how each action felt, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, as if every small movement belonged entirely to me again, and I stood there watching the steam rise in slow curls, thinking about how many mornings I had spent worrying about whether Daniel had eaten breakfast, whether he was getting enough rest, whether his life was moving in the direction I had hoped for him, and it occurred to me that I had spent decades building a life centered around someone who no longer saw me as part of his center, and that realization did not come with anger, it came with a quiet kind of understanding that settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle. And I carried my coffee to the dining table, sitting down in the same chair where I used to host Sunday dinners, where the table would be filled with food and conversation and the soft overlapping of voices that once felt like proof that everything was still connected, and I let my eyes move across the room, noticing the details I had stopped seeing, the framed photographs along the wall, Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball glove too big for his hand, Daniel at graduation standing beside me with that same quiet smile he had even then, and I wondered at what point that smile had started to carry distance instead of warmth, at what point our conversations had shifted from easy and open to careful and measured, and I realized that it had not happened all at once, it had happened gradually, shaped by choices I did not question at the time, by moments I chose to overlook because they seemed too small to matter, and I set my cup down gently, the sound barely noticeable against the stillness of the room. And I thought about Vanessa again, not with the sharp edge of last night but with a more deliberate focus, tracing back the moments that had once felt insignificant, the first time she had insisted on hosting holidays instead of me. Saying it would be easier for everyone, the way she reorganized conversations so that plans were made without ever directly excluding me, just adjusting them until my presence was no longer necessary, and I had allowed it, not because I agreed with it but because I believed that stepping back was a form of support, that giving them space would strengthen the family rather than weaken it. But now I could see that space had been used differently, not as a bridge but as a boundary, one that had been drawn carefully, deliberately, until it became something I could not cross without resistance, and I reached for my phone, holding it for a moment without unlocking it, considering whether I expected a message, an explanation, anything at all. But there was nothing, no missed calls, no text, just the same still screen reflecting back a version of myself that looked exactly as it had the day before, except that something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, and I placed the phone back on the table, not with disappointment but with a sense of confirmation, because sometimes the absence of action tells you more than any explanation ever could, and I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze settle once more on the photographs, and I understood that the life I had built, the one I believed would carry me forward through these later years, had already changed shape, not overnight but slowly, quietly, until it no longer fit the person I had become, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss that needed to be fixed, it felt like a reality that needed to be acknowledged, and as I sat there in the stillness of my own home, I realized that what came next would not be about restoring what had been taken, it would be about deciding what I was no longer willing to give away. By mid-afternoon I found myself standing in front of the small wooden cabinet in my study, the one I had not opened in months, maybe longer, the one where I kept documents that once felt too important to leave out in the open. And I rested my hand on the handle for a moment before pulling it open, not with hesitation but with a kind of steady intention that surprised even me, and inside, everything was exactly where I had left it, neatly organized, labeled, a reflection of the way I had always tried to keep my life in order even when emotions threatened to make things messy, and I reached for the folder marked with my name, Margaret Collins, printed clearly across the front, and I carried it to the desk by the window, sitting down slowly as the afternoon light stretched across the surface in long, quiet lines, and I began to go through each document one by one, not rushing, not skimming, but reading carefully, absorbing details I had not revisited in years, the house deed, the savings accounts, the investment records, all the pieces that made up the foundation I had spent decades building, not just for myself but for Daniel, for the future I believed we would share in some way, even as he built his own life, and I remembered the conversations we used to have when he was younger, how I would explain the importance of stability, of planning, of making sure that no matter what happened, there would always be something solid to stand on, and he would nod, sometimes understanding, sometimes not, but always listening, always present in a way that felt genuine, and I paused for a moment, letting that memory settle before continuing, because what I was doing now was not about holding on to the past, it was about understanding the present with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, and as I moved through the documents, I began to notice small changes, updates I had made over the years, adjustments that reflected shifts in my life, some intentional, some made out of habit, and I realized that for a long time I had been operating under an assumption that no longer held true, that everything I had built would naturally flow toward Daniel, that it would remain within a circle of trust that I no longer recognized, and I set the papers down gently, folding my hands together for a moment as I looked out the window, watching a car pass slowly down the street, its movement steady, predictable, and I thought about how easy it is to continue along a path simply because it has always been there, because it feels familiar, even when the destination has changed without you noticing, and I stood up then. Not abruptly but with a quiet sense of purpose, carrying the folder with me as I walked into the hallway, past the framed photographs, past the memories that had once defined everything I believed about family, and I realized that what I was about to do was not an act of reaction, it was not driven by anger or hurt, it was a decision rooted in something much deeper, something that had been forming long before last night, even if I had not fully acknowledged it, and I stepped into my bedroom, placing the folder on the dresser before reaching for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, a name I had not needed to call in quite some time, and I paused for just a second before pressing the button, listening as the line began to ring, each tone steady and measured, and when the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I felt that same clarity return, stronger now, more defined, and I spoke in an even tone, introducing myself, explaining that I needed to review and update my arrangements, that it had been too long since I had looked at them properly, and as I listened to the response, scheduling a meeting for later that week, I understood that this was the first step, not a dramatic one, not something anyone else would notice immediately, but significant in a way that only I needed to understand, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer assuming that the future would take care of itself. I was choosing to shape it, deliberately, quietly, and entirely on my own terms. The appointment was set for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, and when the day arrived, I chose my clothes with the same quiet care I had always given to important moments, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because I understood that how I carried myself was part of how I moved through the world, and I drove to the office building just outside downtown, a place I had been to years before, though it looked slightly different now, newer signage, freshly painted walls, small changes that reminded me how time continues moving whether we pay attention to it or not, and I parked in the visitor lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a brief moment, not out of hesitation but to acknowledge that this step mattered, that it marked a shift I had finally chosen to make visible, and when I stepped inside, the air felt cool and still, the kind of controlled environment where everything was designed to remain orderly, predictable, and I appreciated that, because it matched the clarity I had been building inside myself since that night at the restaurant, and when I was greeted and led into the office, the attorney recognized me immediately, offering a polite smile, mentioning how long it had been since we last reviewed my documents, and I returned the greeting with the same calm tone I had practiced over the past few days, explaining that circumstances had changed, that I needed to revisit certain decisions, and as we sat across from each other, papers spread neatly between us, I began to speak with a level of precision that surprised even me, outlining what I wanted, what no longer applied, what needed to be adjusted, and I did not mention Vanessa, I did not describe the dinner, I did not explain the silence that had followed, because none of that was necessary, the reasons were clear to me, and that was enough, and as we worked through each detail, the structure of my future began to take shape in a way that felt deliberate rather than assumed, properties reassigned, access redefined, instructions updated so that nothing would be left to interpretation or convenience, and I listened carefully as each point was clarified, asking questions when needed, making sure that every decision reflected not who I had been years ago, but who I was now, someone who understood that trust must be supported by actions, not just expectations, and when the documents were finalized for review, I took a moment to read through them again, slowly, line by line, not because I doubted the process, but because I wanted to fully recognize the weight of what I was choosing, and when I finally signed my name, the motion felt steady, certain, as if it had been waiting for me to reach this point for a long time, and as the papers were gathered and set aside, the attorney spoke about next steps, timelines, formalities, but I was already aware of what mattered most, that the foundation I had built over decades now reflected my understanding of the present, not the illusion I had held on to before, and when I left the office, stepping back into the afternoon light, I felt something settle into place, not relief exactly, not satisfaction in the way people might expect, but a quiet alignment between what I knew and what I had done, and as I walked to my car, I realized that nothing outward had changed yet. Daniel would still go about his life, Vanessa would still believe she understood the direction things were moving, and the world would continue as it always had. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted, something that no longer depended on their acknowledgement or approval, and as I drove away, merging into the steady flow of traffic, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was simply the moment where my silence had finally taken on a form they would one day have to face, whether they were prepared for it or not. A few days passed without a single word from Daniel, and I noticed it not because I was waiting, but because the silence had become something I could observe rather than something I felt the need to fill, and on Sunday morning, as I was folding laundry in the quiet of my living room, my phone finally lit up with his name, and I let it ring once, twice, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to answer it on my own terms, not with the reflex I had carried for years, and when I picked up, his voice came through steady but distant, asking how I was, as if nothing had happened, as if the space between us had not been carved out so clearly just days before, and I answered in the same tone, calm, measured, telling him I was doing well, and there was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal discomfort beneath the surface, and he cleared his throat before mentioning the dinner, not directly, not with any real acknowledgement, just a vague reference to things getting out of hand, and I listened without interrupting, letting his words settle exactly as they were, incomplete, careful, avoiding the center of what mattered, and when he finished, I simply said that I understood, not because I agreed, but because I recognized what he was choosing not to say, and there was another silence, heavier this time, as if he had expected something else from me, an emotional reaction, a question, something that would allow him to step into a more familiar role, but I did not offer it, and after a moment, he shifted the conversation, mentioning that he and Vanessa were planning a small gathering the following weekend, something casual, and he asked if I would like to come, the invitation sounding more like a test than a gesture, and I held the phone gently against my ear, considering not the event itself, but the meaning behind it, the pattern it represented, the expectation that I would return to the same position, the same dynamic, without anything truly changing, and I answered him evenly, thanking him for the invitation, but explaining that I had other plans, which was true, even if those plans involved nothing more than spending the day in my own home, in my own space, without the weight of unspoken tensions pressing against every interaction, and he hesitated, clearly not expecting that response, and for a moment, I could hear the faint shift in his breathing, the subtle adjustment of someone recalculating a situation they thought they understood, and he asked if everything was all right. The question coming a little too late to carry the meaning it might have once held, and I told him that everything was exactly as it needed to be, and I meant it, not as a reassurance for him, but as a statement of fact for myself, and when the call ended, I placed the phone down on the table beside me, returning to the simple task of folding the last shirt, smoothing out the fabric with slow, deliberate movements, and I realized that what had changed was not just the circumstances, but my response to them, the way I no longer felt compelled to adjust myself to maintain a sense of connection that was no longer mutual, and later that afternoon, as the sunlight moved gradually across the room, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood, people walking their dogs, cars passing at regular intervals, life continuing in its steady, predictable way, and I understood that Daniel would need time to notice the shift, to recognize that something fundamental had changed in the space between us, and whether he chose to understand it or not was no longer something I could control, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss, it felt like a boundary, clear and defined, one that I had finally drawn for myself without needing anyone else to acknowledge it. It was the following Thursday when I saw Vanessa again, though not in the way she would have expected, and it happened in a place that felt almost neutral, a quiet coffee shop just off Main Street where I occasionally stopped in the mornings. A place where no one knew our history, where no one carried any expectations about who we were to each other, and I had just settled into a small table by the window when the door opened and she walked in, her posture confident, her expression composed in that careful way she had mastered, and for a brief moment, our eyes met, and I could see the flicker of recognition cross her face, followed quickly by something more calculated, as if she were already deciding how this interaction would unfold, and she approached my table without hesitation, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she greeted me in a tone that was almost casual, as if the last time we had been in the same room had not ended in silence and distance, and I returned the greeting with the same calm politeness I had carried with me in recent days, gesturing lightly to the empty chair across from me, not as an invitation, but as an acknowledgement of her presence, and she sat down, placing her phone carefully on the table, her movements precise, controlled, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet stretching between us in a way that felt familiar, though different now, because it no longer held uncertainty, it held clarity, and she was the first to break it, mentioning that Daniel had told her about our phone call, her voice carrying a hint of something she did not fully reveal, and I nodded slightly, confirming without elaborating, and she continued, saying that things had been stressful lately, that misunderstandings happen, that sometimes emotions get the better of people, and I listened to her words, noting how carefully they were chosen, how they avoided any direct acknowledgement of what had actually taken place, and when she finished, she looked at me as if waiting for me to fill in the space she had left open, but I did not, and after a moment, I spoke, not with accusation, not with confrontation, but with a simple clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. I told her that I understood that people show you who they are, not just in what they say, but in what they allow, and I let that sentence rest between us, steady and complete, and she shifted slightly in her seat, her composure adjusting just enough to reveal that the conversation was not moving in the direction she had anticipated, and she responded by saying that Daniel was under a lot of pressure, that he had responsibilities, that sometimes he struggled to balance everything, and I listened, recognizing the familiar pattern, the redirection, the subtle repositioning of responsibility, and I did not argue, I did not correct her, I simply nodded, acknowledging that explanation without accepting it as something that required my agreement, and I took a slow sip of my coffee, placing the cup back down with the same measured care, and I told her that balance comes from choices, not from circumstances, and that everyone decides what they are willing to carry and what they are willing to set aside, and this time, she did not respond immediately, her silence carrying a different weight now, one that suggested she was beginning to understand that this conversation was not something she could guide or reshape, and after a moment, she asked, almost casually, if I would be coming to the gathering this weekend after all, and I met her gaze directly, answering in the same calm tone, that I would not, and that I believed it was best for everyone if things remained as they were for now. And she studied me for a second longer, as if trying to find something in my expression that would give her an advantage, but there was nothing there for her to use, only a steady certainty that did not shift under her attention, and she nodded finally, standing up with the same controlled movements she had arrived with, offering a brief goodbye before turning and walking back toward the door, and I watched her leave without following her with my eyes for long, because what mattered was not where she was going, but what had just been made clear. And as I sat there in the quiet of that small coffee shop, I understood that the roles we had once played no longer applied, that whatever influence she believed she held over the shape of my life had already been removed. Not through confrontation, not through argument, but through a series of decisions she had not even realized were being made, and for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible sense of finality, not as an ending, but as the closing of a door that I had finally chosen not to reopen. The weekend of their gathering came and passed with a kind of quiet that felt deliberate, not empty, and on Saturday afternoon, while I was trimming the small rose bushes in my backyard, my phone buzzed once on the table beside me, a soft interruption that I did not rush to answer, and when I finally picked it up, I saw a message from Daniel, short and carefully worded, telling me that everyone was asking about me, that it felt strange not having me there, and I read it once, then again, not searching for hidden meaning, but observing what was actually there, the absence of anything real, anything that acknowledged what had changed, and I set the phone back down without replying immediately, returning my attention to the roses, clipping away the dry edges, shaping them back into something healthy, something intentional, and as I worked, I thought about how often I had done the same with relationships, trimming around problems, adjusting my own behavior to maintain a certain appearance, to preserve something that had already begun to lose its structure, and I realized that I was no longer interested in maintaining appearances, not when the foundation itself had shifted so clearly, and after a while, I washed my hands, dried them slowly, and picked up my phone again, typing a response that was simple, direct, and complete, telling him that I hoped they were having a nice time, and that I was exactly where I needed to be, and I sent it without hesitation, not because I wanted to distance myself, but because I no longer felt the need to step back into a role that no longer fit, and the rest of the day moved forward in a steady, unremarkable rhythm, the kind of quiet continuity that I had once feared but now found grounding, and the following Monday morning, as I was organizing a few papers at my desk, the doorbell rang, a sound that felt unexpected in its timing, and when I opened the door, Daniel stood there, his expression more uncertain than I had seen in years, as if he had stepped into a space he no longer fully understood, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke, the silence holding a different weight now, not tense, not fragile, but defined, and I stepped aside, allowing him to come in, not out of obligation, but because this was still my home, my space, and I chose who entered it, and he walked in slowly, looking around as if noticing details he had overlooked before. The photographs, the furniture, the quiet order of everything, and when he finally turned to face me, he began to speak, his words hesitant at first, then more steady, explaining that things had felt different lately, that he was not sure how to understand the distance, and I listened without interrupting, not because I was waiting for an explanation, but because I wanted to hear what he believed the situation was, and when he finished, I spoke in the same calm tone I had carried through each step of this change, telling him that distance does not appear without reason, that it grows when something important is left unacknowledged, and I let that settle before continuing, explaining that what mattered was not a single evening, not one moment, but the pattern of choices that led to it, the silence, the absence, the decisions made without regard for what they meant, and he listened, his expression shifting in small ways that suggested he was beginning to see what he had not allowed himself to see before, and for a moment, there was something almost familiar in his posture, something that reminded me of the boy he once was, trying to understand something just beyond his reach, and I did not push, I did not press further, because this was not about forcing recognition, it was about allowing him to reach it on his own, and as the conversation moved forward, slowly, carefully, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by old habits or unspoken expectations. It would be defined by clarity, by boundaries that had already been set, and by a quiet understanding that what had been changed could not simply return to what it was before. Daniel stayed longer than I expected that day, not because the conversation demanded it, but because neither of us seemed ready to return to the version of silence we had lived in before, and after a while, we moved into the kitchen, the same space where I had spent years preparing meals that once brought us together without effort, and I poured 2 glasses of water, placing one in front of him, a small gesture that felt familiar but carried a different meaning now, not an act of care rooted in obligation, but one chosen freely, without expectation of anything in return, and he thanked me quietly, his voice softer than before, as if he were beginning to understand that the way we spoke to each other mattered in ways he had overlooked, and we sat across from each other at the table, the same table that had once held laughter and easy conversation, now holding something more measured, more deliberate, and after a moment, he asked a question that lingered in the air longer than the words themselves. He asked if things could go back to the way they were, and I looked at him steadily, not with disappointment, not with judgment, but with a clarity that had taken me years to reach, and I told him that returning to the past is only possible when nothing has been understood, when nothing has been seen for what it truly is, and that once you recognize a pattern, once you understand the choices that shape it, you cannot simply step back into it as if it never existed, and he listened, his expression shifting slightly, not defensive, not resistant, but thoughtful in a way that suggested he was finally allowing himself to consider something beyond his usual perspective, and I continued, explaining that what mattered now was not recreating what we had, but deciding what we were willing to build moving forward, and that would require honesty, not just in words, but in actions, in the way we showed up for each other, in the way we allowed or did not allow certain things to happen, and I paused then, letting that settle, giving him space to process it without pressure, and after a moment, he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something he had not fully articulated yet, and he said that he had not realized how much had changed, that he had assumed things would remain stable no matter what, and I told him that stability does not come from assumption, it comes from attention, from the willingness to notice when something begins to shift and to address it before it becomes something else entirely, and the conversation moved quietly from there, not dramatic, not filled with sudden resolutions, but grounded in a different kind of understanding, one that did not erase what had happened, but did not need to, because the point was not to undo the past, it was to ensure that the future was not shaped by the same patterns, and when he eventually stood to leave, there was a hesitation in his movement, as if he were aware that this moment marked something important, even if he could not fully define it yet, and he thanked me again, more deliberately this time, and as he walked toward the door, I followed at a measured pace, not to escort him out, but to stand at the threshold of something that had quietly but firmly changed, and when he stepped outside, he turned back for a brief second, as if considering whether to say something more, but instead, he simply nodded, and I returned the gesture with the same calm certainty I had carried through every step of this process, and as I closed the door behind him, the house settled into its familiar quiet. But it no longer felt like something missing, it felt like something defined, something intentional, and I walked back into the living room, pausing briefly by the window where the afternoon light filtered in, steady and unchanged, and I realized that what I had done was not about pushing anyone away, it was about standing firmly in a place that could no longer be moved without my consent, and whatever Daniel chose to do with that understanding would be his decision, his responsibility. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to guide it, no need to shape it, because I had already done what was necessary, quietly, deliberately, and without needing anyone else to recognize it before it was real.